A sharp, antiseptic aroma hung heavy in the air of the austere city hospital room in Queens. It mingled with the metallic scent of blood that still lingered, an assault on Eleanor's heightened senses. After the grueling labor she had endured just hours before, her body felt as if it had been torn into 1,000 pieces and then hastily sewn back together. Every fiber of her muscles screamed in protest as she lay motionless on the coarse white sheet. Her vacant eyes stared at the ceiling, tears of exhaustion slowly tracing paths down her pale cheeks. The silence in the room was almost deafening, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. Her heartbeat was the only cold witness to her survival, but deep within her, a violent storm of anxiety was brewing over her husband. Richard had yet to appear, even though the nurses had long since informed him of the joyous news of the birth of their 3 children. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door was thrown open with a force that startled Eleanor, and Richard strode into the room. His expensive Italian leather loafers tapped a sharp, cold rhythm on the polished linoleum floor. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray designer suit that fit his form perfectly. However, his handsome face showed not the slightest glimmer of the joy or relief normally seen in a new father. On the contrary, his charming features were twisted into a mask of icy indifference and an expression of disgust he made no effort to conceal. He did not cast a single glance at the 3 small bassinets where his newborn children slept peacefully. Nor did he bother to approach the bed to ask how his wife felt after she had risked her life to bring his heirs into the world. He simply stood motionless at the foot of the bed, arms crossed over his chest, staring at Eleanor with a glacial coldness that made the room's temperature seem to plummet. Not a word of greeting or comfort came from his lips. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and disdainfully tossed it onto the bed, where it landed with a dull thud right at Eleanor's feet. Eleanor looked at the envelope, confusion clouding her tired eyes. Her trembling hand reached out to touch the cool surface of the paper as a sense of foreboding began to squeeze her chest, making each breath painful. Richard ordered her with a voice devoid of warmth or emotion, cutting through the silence like a sharp scalpel, to sign the document immediately. He said he was fed up with this charade of poverty and did not want to waste another second tied to a woman who only knew how to be a financial burden to his brilliant future. Eleanor's heart seemed to stop for a moment as she understood the contents of that document. The bold words of the divorce petition struck her eyes like a death sentence for the life she thought she was building. Eleanor whispered, asking what all this meant. Her voice was hoarse and broken with emotion as she tried to sit up. Despite the searing pain in her abdomen that tormented her without mercy, she pleaded with Richard to see reality. Their children had just been born a few hours ago. They needed a father's presence, and she desperately needed a husband's support in her moment of greatest weakness. Richard laughed. It was a harsh, painful laugh, laden with mockery. Then he moved closer to loom over Eleanor, like a predator cornering its prey. He pointed an accusatory finger at her, saying the children were her mistake, not part of his plans. He scoffed at her for being too naive. If she thought giving birth to triplets all at once could tie him forever to this mediocre and boring life, he declared that he had ambitions far greater than being merely the husband of a housewife with no social connections or valuable assets to boost his career. He glanced impatiently at his luxury watch, making it clear he would rather be anywhere else, anywhere but there with his convalescing wife and newborn babies. He stated, with a cruel smile playing on his lips, enjoying the visible shock on Eleanor's face, that Tiffany was waiting for him in the lobby, and she did not like to wait. He praised Tiffany as a real woman, beautiful, classy, and most importantly, her father owned the majority of the shares in the investment firm where Richard worked, someone who could rocket him to the pinnacle of success in the blink of an eye, something Eleanor could never do even if she tried her entire life. The name Tiffany, the woman Eleanor had suspected for months but whose suspicions had always been silenced with reassuring words full of lies, hit her like a physical blow, shattering every fragile hope she still harbored for her marriage into 1,000 pieces. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes again, but this time they were not from physical exhaustion, but from the immense inner suffering and the shock of confronting the monster before her. She asked Richard, with a trembling voice, which was beginning to sound a little firmer as the truth of her husband's betrayal sank into her heart. If he had just been using her all this time, and was now discarding her like trash just when she needed him most. Richard shrugged indifferently, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the window, not caring in the least about his wife's suffering. He said coldly that there was no need to dramatize the situation. He would leave her the modest apartment and a small monthly stipend, enough so she and the children wouldn't starve, but she shouldn't expect more, because from that day forward, they were strangers. He turned his back on her, walking out the door without even a glance at the babies who were beginning to stir and cry, sensing the tension in the room. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Eleanor alone once more in a suffocating silence, but this time the silence felt infinitely heavier, burdened with the weight of rejection and a bleak, dark future. She forced her aching body to move, lowering her legs from the bed and ignoring the loud protests of her muscles. She staggered toward the bassinets where her 3 little miracles lay. As she gazed at their small, innocent, and fragile faces, a powerful wave of protectiveness surged within her, mixed with the unbearable pain of the rejection she had just suffered. How could a father turn his back on these angels? How could the man she had loved for the past 5 years become a cruel stranger in the blink of an eye? She collapsed to the floor beside the bassinets, sobbing uncontrollably, but trying to muffle her voice so as not to wake her children, feeling as if her world had completely fallen apart. The minutes passed, heavy as centuries, as Eleanor sat there, sunk in an abyss of despair, until a polite but firm knock on the door brought her back to the harsh reality. She hastily wiped her tears, thinking it was a nurse or a doctor coming to check on her. But when the door opened, a group of people she would never have expected entered the small room. At the forefront was an elderly man with impeccably styled silver hair, dressed in a bespoke 3-piece suit. His posture was erect and dignified despite his advanced age. Behind him followed 4 men in black suits carrying leather briefcases. Their faces were serious and respectful. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding. She recognized the elderly man as the butler who had served her family for decades, a familiar face she had not seen since she ran away from home to marry Richard. Winston approached her with timeless elegance, stopping a few feet away before kneeling on one knee, bowing his head deeply in a sign of absolute respect. The 4 lawyers behind him immediately did the same, creating a surreal scene in that hospital room that smelled of antiseptic. Winston's voice trembled slightly with contained emotion as he greeted the young Miss Eleanor and apologized for taking so many years to find her. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. The facade of the ordinary housewife she had worn for so long began to crack. She whispered the old man's name, asking how he had found her there. Winston looked up, his eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and relief as he looked at the woman who was once the little girl he used to carry on his shoulders running through the mansion's gardens. Winston delivered the news gently, but the information hit her with a different, more complex and profound pain. Her father, the great Mr. Prescott, had passed away 3 days ago. Before he died, he had changed his entire will, revoking all inheritance rights of other greedy relatives and leaving everything to his only lost daughter. One of the lawyers stepped forward, opened his leather briefcase, and took out a stack of documents that looked far more important than the divorce papers Richard had left. The lawyer said in a tone of professional respect that according to this legal will, Eleanor was now the majority shareholder of the Prescott Group and the sole owner of a personal estate valued at $5 billion, including properties, trust funds, and global investments. The figures floated in the air, creating a sharp and ironic contrast with the small stipend Richard had just mentioned with disdain a few minutes ago. Eleanor stood up slowly. The physical pain seemed forgotten for a moment as the weight of this truth settled on her shoulders. She looked from the divorce papers scattered on the floor to the multi-billion-dollar inheritance documents in the lawyer's hands. The bitter irony was so sharp she felt as if she were tasting blood in her mouth. Richard had left her because he thought she was a useless burden, chasing another woman whose wealth was but a speck of dust compared to what Eleanor now possessed. A fire began to burn in her eyes, drying the tears of the weak and abandoned wife and replacing them with the steely gaze of a sovereign. She had given up her family's wealth to prove that true love could exist without money, but Richard had shown her she was wrong in the cruelest way possible. And now she would no longer be Eleanor the housewife. She was Eleanor Prescott, the queen who had returned to her throne. Eleanor's voice changed completely, shedding the tremor of sadness and adopting a tone of authority she was destined to possess but had long suppressed. She ordered Winston to rise. She asked him to immediately prepare the best medical team to transfer her and her children to the Prescott Group's private care facilities because she did not want to remain in this depressing place for another minute. She walked over to the divorce papers, picked them up, and slowly tore them into pieces, letting the fragments fall to the floor like snowflakes mourning a dead marriage. She turned to the lawyers and ordered them to contact the best legal team. She declared that if her ex-husband wanted to play dirty, she would make sure he paid a price so high he would regret ever being born. Winston smiled. An expression of genuine pride returned to his old face as he bowed once more, confirming that all her orders would be executed immediately, marking the beginning of a sweet revenge. The journey from the crowded and noisy city hospital to the private medical facilities of the Prescott family was like passing between two dimensions of a completely different world. A transition that marked the end of Eleanor's life as a mistreated wife and the beginning of a new era as the sole sovereign of unimaginable wealth. A convoy of high-end black SUVs sliced through the streets of Manhattan with military precision, escorting the limousine where Eleanor and her 3 babies rested with a level of high security that even made other drivers move aside with respect. Inside the silent, expensive, leather-scented cabin, Eleanor reclined, looking through the tinted windows as the skyscrapers passed by. As the sun set, taking with it the last vestiges of her naive past life, Winston sat opposite her with his back straight, watching over the 3 advanced portable incubators, transporting the little Prescott heirs with the alertness of a loyal guardian, ensuring that no jolt disturbed their deep sleep. Upon arriving at the VIP wing of the Prescott Clinic, Eleanor was not received as just any patient, but as a queen returning from the battlefield with the wounds of victory that needed to be healed immediately. The entire top floor had been cleared exclusively for her, transformed into a medical suite that far surpassed the standards of any 5-star hotel in the country. The walls were lined with warm mahogany panels, the floor covered with thick, soft Persian rugs, and the night view of the Manhattan skyline stretched out from the floor to ceiling windows, offering a perspective of absolute power. The best medical specialists and private nurses who had sworn confidentiality lined up to welcome her, ready to attend to all her medical and comfort needs without her having to ask. Eleanor was laid on a bed with the highest quality silk sheets, feeling a physical comfort that contrasted brutally with the searing pain that Richard's cruelty had left in her heart just hours before. After ensuring that her 3 babies were receiving the best care in the private nursery connected directly to her room, Eleanor asked for a moment alone before discussing business matters with the legal team. She forced herself to get up and walked slowly to the large wall mirror, looking at herself with a piercing gaze that scrutinized her own soul. The woman who looked back from the mirror seemed pale and fragile, with dark circles under her eyes that were silent witnesses to sleepless nights and the inner suffering she had endured. But behind that physical fragility, Eleanor saw something new beginning to grow, a steely determination forged in the fire of betrayal that had burned away any form of tenderness Richard had exploited. She touched her own reflection in the mirror, promising the woman she saw that this would be the last time she would look wretched because from tomorrow on the world would know that face not as that of a victim, but as that of a conqueror. Her mind drifted to the past, remembering the impulsive yet romantic decision she made 5 years ago when she chose to abandon the great Prescott name to seek a pure love, untainted by wealth. She remembered how she met Richard, an ambitious young man from a middle-class family who made her believe that love could be built from scratch, fighting side by side against the hardships of the world. Eleanor had hidden her identity perfectly, living simply, cooking, cleaning, and even saving from the grocery money to buy Richard a decent desk. She did all that in the hope that Richard would love her for who she was, not for the billion-dollar inheritance that awaited her. Richard, in fact, had passed that initial test. He married the poor Eleanor, but as time went on and his ambitions grew, the man's mask began to crack and finally shattered at the very moment Eleanor most needed support. Her love experiment had failed spectacularly, and the price was her broken heart. However, she had at least obtained 3 precious jewels who were now sleeping peacefully in the next room. Her daydreams were interrupted when Winston knocked gently on the door, informing her that the team of senior lawyers was ready to carry out the official transfer of assets and power, according to her late father's will. Eleanor nodded, inviting them in, and the atmosphere in the room instantly changed from a recovery suite to a tense boardroom. The lawyers spread several voluminous documents before her, explaining the details of the assets that were now under her control, from majority shares in mining companies and international hotel chains to real estate in several world capitals. The figures that appeared there were so fantastic that they were difficult for an ordinary person to process. But for Eleanor, who had been educated for this role since childhood, everything felt familiar. She listened to their reports attentively again, her eyes examining each clause with an acuity that made the veteran lawyers break into a cold sweat, realizing that their young miss was not some pretty doll ignorant of business. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, in an exclusive nightclub in the meatpacking district, filled with the smoke of expensive cigars and intoxicating music, Richard was celebrating his freedom with euphoria and without the slightest remorse. He was sitting on a red velvet sofa in the VIP area, a crystal glass with the most expensive champagne in one hand, while the other possessively wrapped around the slender waist of Tiffany, who was laughing flirtatiously beside him. Richard's sycophantic friends surrounded them, congratulating him on both the birth of his children and his divorce, a moral irony that only those who had lost their conscience in pursuit of social status could understand. Richard felt like the king of the world that night, free from the burden of a boring wife and noisy children, and convinced that his future with Tiffany would lead him to the pinnacle of success he had always dreamed of. He told his friends how relieved he felt to have finally gotten rid of the parasite that was holding back his career, referring to Eleanor with a derogatory tone that was met with laughter from Tiffany and her friends. Tiffany, in a designer dress that showcased her curves and diamond jewelry that sparkled under the club's lights, looked at Richard with calculated adoration, seeing him as a trophy of her victory over another woman. She whispered sweet nothings in his ear, promising that her father would soon appoint him as the CEO of one of his subsidiaries as a wedding gift. Richard grinned from ear to ear, his ego soaring, feeling that his decision to divorce Eleanor was the most brilliant business move he had ever made in his life. He imagined Eleanor at that moment, crying in a modest apartment, counting pennies to buy milk, and that thought gave him a sadistic satisfaction, a validation that he was the winner in the drama of life. He had no idea that far above him, in the true ivory tower of power, the woman he had humiliated was preparing a storm of destruction, especially for him. Back in the luxurious hospital room, Winston handed Eleanor a special file with a red cover, a file that contained a secret Eleanor had jealously guarded from Richard. The file contained complete data on Apex Innovations. Richard's startup, which he had always boasted was the result of his own hard work and genius. Eleanor flipped through the pages of the company's financial report with an ironic smile, seeing the fact that for the past 3 years, Richard's company had been on the verge of bankruptcy repeatedly, but every time it was about to collapse, an angel investor or a miraculous project would always appear and save it at the last second. Richard would always come home arrogantly, bragging about his great negotiations, never knowing that this angel investor was Eleanor's own trust fund, channeled through several shell companies to protect her husband's pride. Eleanor looked at the figures of the investments she had secretly injected to support the dreams of the man who had now discarded her like trash. All this time she had lived austerely, refraining from buying new clothes, pretending that her salary as a freelance translator was barely enough to eat, when in reality she was injecting millions of dollars to cover Richard's incompetence in managing his business. Love had blinded her, made her willing to be the unsung hero behind the scenes, allowing Richard to live in the illusion that he was a successful and independent entrepreneur. But that night, that illusion had to end in the most painful way for Richard to realize that without Eleanor, he was nothing more than an ordinary man with average skills and too many dreams. Eleanor took the gold pen that Winston offered her, its tip hovering over the paper of the investment cooperation termination order. With a calm voice that contained a deadly authority, Eleanor asked Winston about the status of this quarter's fund injection, which was due to arrive tomorrow morning to save the operations of Richard's company. Winston explained in detail that without those funds, Richard's company would go into default with suppliers and banks in less than 48 hours, which would lead to the seizure of assets and total bankruptcy. Eleanor nodded slowly. Her eyes showed not the slightest pity as she remembered Richard's cold face when he threw the divorce papers at her. She told Winston that it was time for Richard to learn to stand on his own 2 feet without the crutch he had so despised. It was time for him to feel the cold of the real business world without Eleanor's warm, protective cloak. Eleanor signed the investment termination document with a firm motion. The stroke of her ink on the white paper was like a death sentence for Richard's career, and she did not stop there. She also instructed the legal team to begin reclaiming all the soft loans that had been granted through the shell companies, with the full commercial interest applicable according to the contracts that Richard had never read carefully, too full of himself. She ordered Winston to contact all the banks that had outstanding debts with Richard's company and exert subtle pressure for them to tighten the credit conditions or demand immediate payment. This was not simply a withdrawal of support. It was a coordinated financial attack, designed to cripple the target with a single, unexpected, and devastating blow. Once the business matters were finished, Eleanor asked Winston to bring one of the incubators closer to her bed. She contemplated the small face of her sleeping son, his tiny fingers clutching the blanket tightly, as if seeking a hold in this new and strange world. Eleanor gently touched the glass of the incubator, whispering a promise to her children that they would never lack love or material possessions in their entire lives. She promised to be both a father and a mother to them, and would make sure that the man who had rejected them would never have the right or the opportunity to harm them again. The presence of her children became her new source of strength, transforming sadness into the fuel of a boundless ambition to build an impregnable fortress around them. The night wore on, and the lights of Manhattan twinkled in the distance like millions of eyes witnessing the rebirth of a goddess of vengeance. Eleanor rested her head on the pillow, feeling the physical exhaustion begin to take over, but her mind remained sharp and awake, planning the next move in this chess game. She knew Richard would wake up tomorrow with a hangover, but that headache would be nothing compared to the financial migraine that would hit him as soon as he set foot in his office. Eleanor closed her eyes. A faint, mysterious smile played on her lips, imagining Richard's terrified face as he realized his world was collapsing, while she would watch the destruction from her ivory tower, with a cup of hot herbal tea in her hand, enjoying the show that had just begun. Winston turned off the main light in the room, leaving a dim nightlight, and then bowed respectfully before slowly retreating to the door to give his lady her privacy. In the hallway outside, he motioned to the bodyguards to reinforce the security, ensuring that not even a fly could enter without permission. He took out his special phone and sent a short, encrypted message to the Prescott family's intelligence network to start digging up every sin, scandal, and weakness of Richard and Tiffany that could be used as ammunition later. The Prescott family's war machine had been fully activated. Its gears were beginning to turn with all their might, ready to grind to dust anyone who dared to insult the blood of its founder. 3 months have passed since that fateful night in the hospital, enough time for a fragile caterpillar to transform into a steel butterfly ready to conquer the skies. Eleanor stood in the middle of the private gym located in the east wing of her new residence. Sweat soaked her body, now much more toned and firm thanks to intensive and disciplined training. She had just finished an hour-long kickboxing session with a professional martial arts trainer, channeling every drop of anger and disappointment from her past into deadly blows against the punching bag. Her physical transformation was astounding. The residual pregnancy weight had disappeared, replaced by a subtle but strong muscle definition. Her once dull skin now glowed thanks to routine spa treatments and the best nutrition. She was no longer the woman who bowed her head in fear, but an Amazonian warrior preparing her body and mind for the long battle ahead, looking at herself in the mirror with a newfound pride. After showering and changing, Eleanor emerged from her dressing room wearing a designer business suit, custom-made to fit her body perfectly. An ivory white jacket with a sharp cut at the shoulders gave her an air of indisputable authority, combined with matching trousers and high heels that made her look imposing. Her long hair, which she used to tie back haphazardly, was now cut into a modern and elegant asymmetrical bob, framing a naturally but decisively made-up face that highlighted the sharpness and calculation in her gaze. Winston was already waiting for her in the main hall with a tablet in his hand, ready to give her the daily report. His eyes showed admiration as he saw the lady who had now fully embraced her identity as the leader of the Prescott Group. Every step Eleanor took on the marble floor resonated with confidence, a signal to the world that her time of mourning was over and her era of leadership had begun. Eleanor's convoy of cars arrived in front of the Prescott Tower, a 50-story skyscraper that symbolized her family's economic dominance on Park Avenue. The employees she passed in the lobby moved aside and bowed respectfully, feeling the intimidating aura emanating from the woman who, until now, had only been a myth in the company's rumors. Eleanor did not smile, only nodded briefly in acknowledgement. Her face remained cold and inscrutable as she headed to the private executive elevator that would take her directly to the top floor. She knew today was another important test, the monthly board meeting, where she would face the minority shareholders and the old executives who still doubted her ability to lead this giant. However, Eleanor felt not the slightest fear. She had studied every inch of the company's reports during long, sleepless nights, memorizing every figure and strategy until they were ingrained in her being. Inside the magnificent meeting room with an oval table of solid teak, the tension was so palpable you could almost touch it when Eleanor entered and took the main seat at the head of the table. The directors, mostly men twice her age, exchanged skeptical glances, underestimating the young and beautiful woman they considered lucky simply for being born rich. One of the oldest directors, Mr. Henderson, with a condescending tone, tried to explain basic financial terms to Eleanor as if she were a lost child. Eleanor let him speak to the end, her face calm and expressionless, before opening her mouth and silencing the entire room with a sharp analysis of the operational inefficiency in the division that Mr. Henderson himself managed. She exposed detailed data on budget leaks and declining performance over the past 3 quarters without looking at a single note, making Mr. Henderson's face turn pale with embarrassment and fear. Eleanor did not stop there. She announced a massive restructuring that would cut unproductive projects and reorient the company's investment toward the green technology and digital infrastructure sector. Her decisions were firm, logical, and visionary, proving she had a business instinct far sharper than her father's. She challenged anyone who did not agree with her new vision to submit their resignation at that very moment, because she did not need freeloaders on her journey to take the Prescott Group to the next level. Silence fell over the room as the directors realized they were not dealing with a spoiled child, but with a lioness ready to devour anyone who stood in her way. The meeting ended with absolute submission, and the news of Eleanor's firmness spread throughout the building like wildfire, consolidating her position as the new sovereign, to be feared and respected. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the atmosphere at the headquarters of Richard's company, Apex Innovations, was the complete opposite of the splendor and order of the Prescott Tower. Chaos reigned like a contagious disease. Phones rang incessantly, staff ran around with panicked faces, and piles of unpaid bills mounted at the reception. Richard sat in his cluttered office with his shirt rolled up and his tie loose. His hair was disheveled because he kept running his hands through it in frustration. He stared at the computer screen that showed a graph of the company's cash flow in a free fall toward deep red, a terrifying sight he never imagined would happen so quickly. The mysterious investor who had been his savior had suddenly disappeared without a trace, cutting off all vital cash flow just when he most needed capital for the major expansion he had promised his new shareholders. His CFO, a middle-aged man who looked consumed by stress, entered the room, trembling with the latest bad news that made Richard's blood boil. The main bank, which had always provided him with soft credit lines, had suddenly frozen the company's account, citing a violation of the debt ratio and a change in internal risk management policy. Not only that, 3 of his main raw material suppliers had stopped shipments that very morning, demanding cash payment for all outstanding invoices before they would send another single screw. Richard slammed his fist on the table so hard that a vase on the edge fell and shattered. He yelled at his director, accusing him of incompetence and demanding that he fix the problem no matter what. He could not accept that the business empire he had built with so much effort, or so he believed, was collapsing before his eyes without warning. In the midst of the crisis storm, the office door opened and Tiffany entered with a radiant smile that completely contrasted with the situation. She was wearing a red cocktail dress and carrying several shopping bags from luxury boutiques. Her expensive perfume quickly filled the room that smelled of sweat and stress. Tiffany sat on Richard's lap, ignoring his tense face, and began to chatter about the plans for their lavish engagement party to be held at a 5-star hotel the following week. She complained about how difficult it was to get a reservation in the ballroom she wanted and asked Richard to transfer the down payment of several $1,000s immediately so no one would take their date. Tiffany's insensitivity to the situation disgusted Richard for the first time, but he swallowed his annoyance because he still needed Tiffany's father's connections to save his dying company. Richard tried to gently but firmly push Tiffany away, trying to explain that the company was experiencing some technical problems and that liquidity was tight due to long-term investments. He lied fluently, hiding the fact that he was almost bankrupt because he knew a woman like Tiffany wouldn't want to be with a failure. He asked Tiffany to be a little patient with the party, or perhaps to ask her father to advance the costs temporarily, with the excuse that Richard's funds were tied up in a deposit. Tiffany's face soured immediately. She stood up and accused Richard of being stingy, saying that her ex-boyfriends had never made a fuss about money for her happiness. Those words bruised Richard's ego, putting him under even more pressure to maintain a facade of success in front of the woman for whom he had left his wife and children. Back at the Prescott Tower, Eleanor was sitting comfortably on a leather sofa in her office, enjoying an herbal tea while listening to the intelligence report that Winston was delivering with a flat but satisfied tone. Winston reported that Richard had been rejected by 5 different banks that day, and his attempts to pressure Tiffany's father to inject funds had also failed, as Tiffany's father himself was facing a sudden tax audit. A coincidence, carefully orchestrated by Eleanor's legal team. Eleanor smiled slightly, sipping her tea slowly, savoring the sweet taste of victory she was beginning to feel. She asked about the Golden Land project on the outskirts of New York, a real estate project that was Richard's only hope to reverse the situation and make a huge profit that could cover all his debts. It was Richard's dream project, something he had worked on the proposal for months with total obsession. Winston placed a blue folder on the table, reporting that the land auction for the project would be held the next morning behind closed doors, and Richard had mortgaged his parents' house and his remaining assets to raise the auction deposit. Richard was convinced he would win because he had inside information about the bidding prices of other competitors. Eleanor took the folder. Her eyes shone coldly as she gave a new, cruel but brilliant instruction. She ordered Winston to register an unknown subsidiary of Prescott as a participant in the auction and to submit a bid slightly higher than Richard's maximum limit, but enough to destroy his hopes. She wanted Richard to feel victory within his grasp, only to snatch it away at the last second, letting him fall from the height of hope into the deepest abyss of despair. The next day, in the stuffy, smoke-filled auction room, Richard sat restlessly, continuously wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He had gambled everything on this moment. If he won this land, he could get a construction loan and save his company, proving to everyone that he was a business genius. The auction process was tight, the price kept rising, and one by one the competitors dropped out until only Richard and a representative of a foreign company he did not know remained. Richard made his final bid, the maximum amount he had from the mortgage money on his parents' house, and held his breath, waiting for the gavel to fall. But the foreign representative calmly raised his paddle again, mentioning a figure that was only 10% higher than Richard's bid, but enough to be the final nail in the coffin of his hopes. The gavel struck, the land was sold to the opposing party, and Richard's world suddenly went dark as if the sun had been extinguished forever. He remained frozen in his chair, his ears ringing, unable to hear the committee's congratulations to the auction winner, while the image of his parents' anger, who were about to lose their home, danced before his eyes. He staggered out of the auction building like a zombie, ignoring Tiffany's calls, who was probably complaining again about the party dress. He did not know that across the street, inside a limousine with tinted windows, Eleanor was watching him through a crack in the window with an emotionless gaze. Eleanor saw the devastation on her ex-husband's face, but she felt no pity in her heart, only the confirmation that justice was being served. Richard had chosen the path of greed, and now he was reaping the whirlwind from the seeds he himself had sown. That evening, Eleanor returned home early, leaving the figure of the ruthless businesswoman at the office door. And returning to be a loving mother to her 3 children, she entered the nursery, decorated with a night sky theme, where her 3 little ones were playing on a soft fur rug, accompanied by 2 certified nannies. Eleanor's face softened instantly. A sincere smile blossomed on her lips as she knelt and opened her arms to receive the warm hugs of those innocent little creatures. She picked them up one by one, kissed their chubby cheeks, and felt a peace that no money could buy. Here was her real world, in the crystal-clear laughter of her children, and she would do anything, even destroy anyone who dared to threaten this happiness, to secure their future. After putting her children to bed, Eleanor returned to her office to review the final preparations for the National Entrepreneurs Gala, to be held in 2 days. It would be her official public debut as the leader of the Prescott Group, the moment she would step out of the shadows and present herself to the world of the American business elite. She looked at the guest list on her tablet, and her finger stopped on a name at the end of the regular guest list, Richard. Eleanor did not deliberately cross out that name. On the contrary, she asked her secretary to send a special VIP invitation to Richard and Tiffany, ensuring they would come with the false hope of finding an investor. The stage was set for the main act, a reunion that would become Richard's worst nightmare and the moment of Queen Eleanor's coronation. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York that night was bathed in the golden light of thousands of giant crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, creating an atmosphere of almost blinding luxury for anyone who entered. It was the most anticipated night of the social calendar for the New York business elite, the National Entrepreneurs Gala Dinner, a place where multi-million-dollar deals were whispered between the clinking of champagne glasses and the fate of large companies was decided with an informal handshake. The air was permeated with expensive perfumes mixed with the smell of money and power, while soft orchestral music flowed in the background, masking the sound of clashing egos of the magnates present. For most of the guests, this night was an opportunity to show off their wealth and connections, but for Richard, it was the last battlefield, a life-or-death gamble in which he had to secure an investor or face the total ruin that already awaited him. Richard entered the ballroom arm-in-arm with Tiffany, struggling to maintain the mask of confidence he used to wear. Although the cold sweat was beginning to soak his expensive tuxedo, he felt like an imposter who had infiltrated a party of kings. The pocket of his jacket was heavy with the business cards he wanted to hand out to anyone willing to listen to his blustering. Tiffany, by his side, seemed oblivious to Richard's attention. She was busy admiring herself, making sure that the silver sequined evening gown she had forced him to buy with an already overdrawn credit card attracted everyone's attention. Tiffany kept whispering complaints about the rental car that had brought them, saying it was less elegant than her friend's, not realizing that the rental cost was the last cash Richard had in his wallet. In the midst of the dense crowd, Richard tried to greet some old acquaintances and former business partners, hoping to start a conversation about investment opportunities in his dying company. However, the response he received was extremely cold and unsettling. People who used to welcome him warmly now seemed to avoid him, making trivial excuses to leave or pretending not to see him. Richard began to feel a growing panic, realizing that the scent of failure might have spread among this elite faster than he thought. He heard rumors in every corner of the room, whispers about a leadership change at the Prescott Group, the sleeping business giant, and about a mysterious sole heir who was said to be officially introduced for the first time that night. Suddenly, the main lights of the ballroom dimmed drastically, leaving a single spotlight focused on the grand, curved staircase at the end of the room. Instantly, all conversations ceased. The authoritative voice of the host echoed through the speakers, announcing with great respect the presence of the new chairwoman of the board of the Prescott Group, the figure who would lead the largest conglomerate in the United States into a new era. The double doors at the top of the staircase opened slowly, and a female figure emerged from the darkness into the light, causing thousands of pairs of eyes to fixate, holding their breath. The woman wore a deep black velvet evening gown, custom designed to cling elegantly to her body, with a pure gold accent at the collar that radiated an aura of majesty and mystery, and a small but ancient diamond tiara that sparkled on her flawless, asymmetrical bob haircut. Richard narrowed his eyes, trying to focus on the figure high above, feeling that there was something very familiar about her posture and the way she stood. His heart began to beat at an irregular rhythm, a subconscious denial forming in his mind, screaming that what he was seeing could not be real. The woman began to descend the stairs with graceful and confident steps. Each touch of her heels seemed to assert her dominance over everyone in the room. When her face was finally captured clearly by the spotlight, Richard felt as if the floor beneath his feet was collapsing. That face, though now professionally made up with a sharp look and a cold, unfamiliar expression, was the same one he had seen every morning at the breakfast table, the face of the woman he had called boring and divorced in the hospital. It was Eleanor. Tiffany, standing next to Richard, gripped his arm with her sharp nails. Her eyes widened in surprise and a burning envy as she saw the woman she considered an inferior rival transformed into the center of the universe. She whispered in a trembling voice, asking Richard if her eyes were deceiving her or if the woman at the top of the stairs was really his ex-wife, the one who was supposedly poor. Richard could not answer. His mouth felt as dry as a desert, his brain short-circuiting, trying to process the reality that was hitting him like a high-speed train. How was it possible that Eleanor, the woman who always wore worn-out robes and counted grocery money, was the sole heiress of the legendary Prescott Group? The memories of Eleanor's little lies, her refusal to talk about her family, and her sudden departure from her parents' house now swirled in Richard's head, forming a complete and terrifying picture of how stupid he had been. Eleanor reached the bottom of the stairs and was greeted by thunderous applause that echoed throughout the room. The leading businessmen rushed to approach her, but she passed among them with a slight, polite but distant smile. She went up to the podium, stood behind the microphone, and looked at the sea of human faces before her with a terrifying calm. Her eyes scanned the room as if searching for someone, and when her gaze met Richard's wide, stunned eyes in the distance, time seemed to stop for both of them. There was no longing or pain in Eleanor's eyes, only the cold gaze of a judge observing a man condemned to death, a silent acknowledgement that she knew Richard was there and that she was enjoying his fear. Eleanor began her speech. Her voice was clear, intelligent, and full of authority, speaking of the vision for the future of the digital economy and corporate social responsibility, topics that Richard once thought were too complex for his wife's simple brain. Every word that came out of Eleanor's mouth was a slap to Richard's ego, demolishing the perception of superiority he had built to hide his insecurity. He realized that the woman speaking of global acquisitions and market strategies was the same one who once massaged his feet after work, the woman he had betrayed for a startup capital that turned out to be insignificant compared to the wealth Eleanor possessed. Richard felt nauseous, a combination of late regret and a greed that was wildly rekindled. A cunning thought began to infiltrate his terrified mind. If Eleanor was a billionaire, then as her ex-husband and the father of her children, he surely still had a chance to get a piece of that giant pie. He abruptly let go of Tiffany's hand, ignoring her protests, and began to push his way through the crowd to get closer to the podium, driven by the illusion that he could fix everything with a sweet conversation. Eleanor's speech ended, and she stepped down from the podium, immediately surrounded by bank directors and politicians who wanted to flatter her, forming a human barrier that was difficult to penetrate. Richard recklessly pushed his way through the line of bodyguards, using his elbows and body to advance, his eyes fixed on the figure of his ex-wife like a madman. When he finally managed to get close enough to be heard, he shouted Eleanor's name with a voice forced to sound familiar and affectionate, hoping to rekindle some old feeling. Eleanor stopped, slowly raising her hand to signal her bodyguards to let the man approach. A mysterious smile appeared on her lips. The curious elite surrounding them quickly formed a circle, sensing an interesting drama, which made Richard feel he had the stage he needed to display his charm. Richard stood in front of Eleanor, trying to catch his breath and fix his disheveled suit. Then he put on his best smile, the one that had always managed to melt the woman's heart. He greeted Eleanor, calling her honey, pretending that the divorce and the humiliation in the hospital had never happened, and praised her incredible appearance that night. He said loudly so those nearby could hear that he was very proud of his wife's achievements and that he always knew she was hiding her great potential to support his career. Richard tried to take Eleanor's hand, wanting to show the world that he still had a claim on the most powerful woman in the room, a desperate move to save his shattered reputation. But Eleanor's hand did not respond. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest and looked at Richard with a gaze that could freeze lava. With a quiet voice, but loud enough to be heard by the inner circle surrounding them, Eleanor interrupted Richard's nonsense with surgical precision. She corrected him coldly, stating that she was no longer his wife, but Miss Eleanor Prescott, and she reminded him that he was the one who threw the divorce papers in her face when she had just given birth. The words slid like daggers, causing the smile on Richard's face to shatter, and the guests around them to start whispering in surprise, looking at Richard with contempt. Eleanor did not stop there. She continued in a formal business tone, saying that she had reviewed the collaboration proposal that Richard's company had submitted to the Prescott Group through a third party, and that she had personally rejected it because Richard's ethical standards and managerial competence were far below the qualifications expected by her company. Richard's face turned red with shame. He felt stripped naked in public, his business integrity and pride shattered in a single brief and deadly sentence. He tried to defend himself, stammering that it was just a domestic misunderstanding and that it should not be mixed with professional business. Eleanor let out a small laugh, a dry, humorless laugh. Then she leaned forward slightly to whisper, but still audible to those closest. She said that the way a person treats their family is a reflection of how they will treat their business partners. And a man who is capable of abandoning his wife and children for a few coins does not deserve the trust to manage even a cent of the Prescott Group's assets. Eleanor turned around, giving her back to Richard, and motioned to Winston that she was done with this little interruption. She continued on her way to the VIP area, followed by the entourage of businessmen who now looked at her with even greater respect. Richard stood there, motionless, in the middle of the ballroom, alone in the crowd, feeling the judgmental stares of hundreds of eyes fixed on his back. Tiffany, who had witnessed everything from a distance, did not come forward to comfort him. On the contrary, she was seen slowly backing away and disappearing into the crowd, clearly not wanting to be splattered by the mud of the humiliation that now covered Richard. The night that was supposed to be Richard's salvation had turned into his worst nightmare, in which he not only lost a business opportunity, but also realized that he had thrown away the most precious diamond in the world to cling to a handful of sand that was now uselessly slipping through his fingers. Richard staggered back, bumping into a waiter carrying a tray of drinks, and the glasses shattered on the floor. The sound of broken glass echoed like the echo of Richard's shattered life. He looked at Eleanor's retreating back, the back he had often seen bent over washing clothes, now erect, proudly bearing the weight of a business empire. The tightness in Richard's chest was no longer panic, but the real pain of a truth he realized too late. Eleanor had never needed Richard to live. It was Richard who had been a parasite, living off the kindness of a sleeping giant. And now the giant had awakened, and there was no place for a little louse like Richard to hide. In the distance, Eleanor sat on a velvet sofa in the VIP area, accepting a glass of mineral water from Winston. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline rush after the confrontation she had waited months for. She watched as security escorted Richard out for causing a disturbance, and a sense of satisfying closure enveloped her. She had proven her point. She had shown who she really was, and this was just the beginning. She knew Richard would not give up so easily. Desperate men do desperate things, and Eleanor was ready for her ex-husband's next stupid move. The chess game was not over, but the queen already dominated the board, and the opposing king was cornered and unprotected. A torrential rain fell on New York that night, as if the sky were weeping for Richard's stupidity, who was now sitting pensively on the wet sidewalk outside the luxurious hotel from which he had just been thrown out like a mangy dog. His expensive tuxedo was soaked and wrinkled, his once impeccable hair now plastered pathetically to his forehead, and the rain mixed with the tears of frustration running down his face. He stared at the hotel's revolving door, where the glamorous world of billionaires was, a world that should have been his if he had not made the stupidest decision of his life. The image of Eleanor, standing at the podium, radiating an aura of power and unlimited wealth, kept replaying in his head like a horror movie he could not turn off, tormenting every cell of his brain with a regret that burned his chest until he felt breathless. Tiffany stood not far away, sheltered under the awning of a bus stop with her arms crossed. Her beautiful face was distorted by an overflowing anger at being publicly humiliated. She screamed at Richard in the middle of the downpour, blaming him for dragging her into this shameful situation and accusing him of being a no-good con man. Tiffany's harsh words hurt Richard's ears, but strangely this time he did not feel provoked to defend himself or to calm her down as usual. He looked at Tiffany with a vacant gaze, and suddenly the charm of the woman who had once blinded him now seemed so superficial and insignificant compared to Eleanor's greatness. Tiffany was just a cheap imitation trinket that shone cheaply, while Eleanor was a pure diamond that he had thrown in the trash, and that awareness made Richard feel sick to his stomach. Without saying a word to Tiffany, who was still ranting about her expensive dress ruined by the splashes of water, Richard stood up and staggered toward his rental car parked on the street. He left Tiffany there alone, ignoring her hysterical screams calling his name, because Richard's mind was now completely focused on a new and urgent goal: to win Eleanor back. His cunning mind began to work quickly, devising scenario after scenario to win back his ex-wife's heart, convincing himself that Eleanor must still feel something for him for the sake of their children. He was sure that behind Eleanor's cold and professional demeanor on stage was still the tender woman who always forgave his mistakes, and he just needed to play the right card to reopen the door to her heart and her safe. The next morning, Richard appeared at the main gate of the Prescott family's private residence with a very different appearance from the previous night, a carefully designed transformation. He wore a plain white shirt, slightly wrinkled, and simple cloth trousers. He had purposefully left his beard unshaven to give an impression of depression and dishevelment, and in his hand he carried a cheap bouquet of white lilies he had bought on the street. He stood in front of the intercom with a pitiful face, begging the security guards to let him see his wife and children, acting like a desperate father who missed his family. He knew the security cameras were recording his every move and hoped Eleanor was watching this dramatic performance from inside her palace, hoping her mother's heart would be moved by the sight of her ex-husband's miserable state. Inside the sophisticated security monitoring room, Eleanor sat sipping her black coffee, watching the screen that showed Richard's pleading face with a flat, inscrutable expression. Winston stood behind her, his old face wrinkled in disgust at Richard's charade, and offered to throw the man out in a more forceful way than with mere words. However, Eleanor raised her hand to stop Winston's intention. Another plan was forming in her sharp mind. She decided to let Richard in. Not because she had softened, but because she wanted to hear for herself how low that man was willing to stoop for money, and she wanted to give him a direct rejection that would destroy his hopes at the root. Eleanor ordered the gates to be opened, preparing for a new chapter in this mind game. Richard entered the magnificent main hall with hesitant steps. His eyes widened as he saw the interior of the house, which resembled a classic European palace with an elegant, modern touch. He saw original paintings by world masters hanging on the walls, Ming Dynasty vases in the corners, and furniture whose price could probably settle all his company's debts immediately. Greed was rekindled in his S-people eyes, strengthening his determination not to leave that house without getting something. When Eleanor finally came down the stairs wearing an elegant silk dress, Richard immediately knelt on the marble floor. Crocodile tears began to well up in his eyes as he crawled toward Eleanor's feet, trying to reach the hem of her dress with trembling hands. With a hoarse, feigned voice, Richard began his emotional attack, saying that he had temporarily lost his mind due to the immense pressure of work. He fabricated a false story that Tiffany had trapped him by giving him drugs or drinks that left him unconscious, and that he had never truly loved her for a second. He swore to God that his heart had always belonged to Eleanor and their children, and that the decision for the divorce was made in an unstable state of mind due to stress. He used random medical terms to justify his cruelty. He pleaded with Eleanor to remember the good times of their courtship, their struggles together, and to give him one last chance to fix their family for the future of their 3 innocent babies. Eleanor listened to Richard's entire speech without interrupting. Her face was as calm as the surface of a frozen lake, but behind that calm lay a controlled fury. When Richard finally stopped talking, breathless and tearless, Eleanor stepped back to avoid his touch, looking at him with deep disgust. She began to speak in a low but sharp tone, dismantling Richard's lies one by one with irrefutable facts. She mentioned specific dates when Richard went on vacation to Bali with Tiffany, while Eleanor was in an advanced and painful pregnancy. She showed proof of money transfers from the household account that Richard used to buy jewelry for his mistress, destroying the victim narrative Richard was building. And she did not stop there. Eleanor then dropped an even bigger truth bomb, aimed directly at Richard's fragile ego as a man and an entrepreneur. She revealed that all this time she had been the main pillar of Richard's business, explaining in detail how she had used her personal funds to cover the stupid losses Richard had caused with impulsive and incompetent business decisions. She told Richard that the success he was so proud of was just an illusion bought with the money of the wife he called a parasite, and that without Eleanor's intervention, Richard would have been destitute for the past 2 years. Richard's face turned pale and then red with a shame mixed with an explosive rage as he realized he had been living on the mercy of the woman he underestimated. Richard's mask of repentance shattered instantly, replaced by his true, ugly, and spiteful face. When he stood up and began to point rudely at Eleanor, he shouted, accusing Eleanor of being a cunning liar who deliberately hid her wealth to play with him and test him like a lab rat. He twisted the facts, saying that his infidelity was the result of Eleanor's dishonesty, that he sought an escape because he felt a distance created by his wife's secrets. A twisted logic. Richard tried to justify his own sins by blaming the victim, a classic manipulative tactic of a cornered narcissist. He demanded compensation for his wasted time and youth with Eleanor, shouting that he had a right to a part of the inheritance as community property. Eleanor let out a cold laugh, a laugh that chilled the bones. Then, she pressed a button on the intercom on the wall to call the security team that was already on alert behind the door. She picked up a copy of the prenuptial agreement that Richard had arrogantly signed back in the day, because at that time he thought Eleanor was poor and did not want to share his assets, and threw it in his face. Eleanor reminded him that according to the law and the document he himself signed, he had no right to a single cent of Eleanor's separate property or inheritance. She stated firmly that he would get no money, no forgiveness, and most importantly, he would never be allowed near her children because he was a toxic and harmful influence. The burly security guards entered, dragging a resisting and cursing Richard out of that sacred hall, throwing him back onto the street where he belonged. Humiliated, furious, and desperate, Richard walked aimlessly through the streets of New York, his heart filled with a burning resentment toward the woman he now considered his greatest enemy. At his lowest point, his phone vibrated, showing a message from Tiffany, who apparently had not completely disappeared from his life. Tiffany, also feeling humiliated and having lost access to a luxurious lifestyle, proposed that Richard meet her at a secluded cafe to discuss a backup plan. The meeting of these two rotten souls took place in a dark corner of the cafe, where Tiffany, with a cunning look, suggested that Richard stop playing the pleading victim and start playing dirty like a lethal attacker. Tiffany reminded Richard that although he had no money, he had the biological status of the father of the sole heirs of the Prescott Group, and that was a very powerful weapon in the eyes of the law. Tiffany began to poison Richard's mind with evil ideas, designing a strategy to attack Eleanor's weakest point, her maternal instinct. She suggested that Richard file a lawsuit for full custody of their 3 children, accusing Eleanor of being a busy, workaholic mother who neglected her children for her business ambitions. Tiffany said that the media would love the story of the cold, billionaire mother versus the poor, caring father, and that they could use public opinion to pressure Eleanor. The goal was not really to take care of the children. Richard did not even remember their full names, but to force Eleanor to pay a huge sum of money for Richard to waive his custody rights. It was a plan of legal extortion, vile, designed to squeeze money from a mother's love. Richard listened to the plan attentively. An evil smile slowly spread across his chapped lips, feeling that he had found a new ray of hope in the darkness of his fate. He imagined Eleanor's terrified face at the threat of losing her children, and that image gave him a sadistic satisfaction. They immediately contacted a scrupulous lawyer, known for handling the dirty cases of celebrities, a man willing to do anything for a percentage of the extortion money. They spent the last of Richard and Tiffany's money on paying the lawsuit fees, drafting a file full of slander that described Eleanor as a heartless career woman incapable of raising her children. A few days later, the tranquility at the Prescott Group headquarters was shattered when a court messenger delivered a large brown envelope directly to Eleanor's personal secretary with the label of "Very Urgent." Eleanor opened the envelope at her spacious desk, and her eyes narrowed dangerously as she read the contents of the custody lawsuit filed by Richard. The document contained vile accusations, stating that Eleanor had mental problems, was emotionally unstable, and that her wealthy environment would corrupt the children's morals. At the end was a separate letter from Richard's lawyer, implicitly offering an out-of-court settlement in exchange for a sum of cash equivalent to half of Eleanor's current liquid wealth. Instead of feeling fear or panic, as Richard and Tiffany expected, Eleanor felt a wave of cold, deadly calm wash over her body, a sign that she had switched to total war mode. She put the document on the table, picked up a photo of her 3 smiling children that she kept in a silver frame, and gently caressed their small faces. Richard had made a fatal mistake by threatening her children. He had awakened the instinct of a mother tiger who would do anything to protect her cubs from a predator. Eleanor called Winston and the head of her legal team through the intercom. Her voice was low and trembling, not from tears, but from contained anger. She ordered them to cancel all meetings for the day and prepare the doomsday protocol to destroy Richard, Tiffany, and their dirty lawyer until not even dust remained. The news of the custody lawsuit was deliberately leaked by Richard's side to the tabloid media that same afternoon, unleashing a frenzy on social media and in national television headlines. The narrative of the battle for the children in a billionaire family became a trend, with many negative comments attacking Eleanor based on the one-sided information spread by Tiffany. Richard was interviewed on television with a sad face, acting like a father wronged by the power of money, while Tiffany stood by his side as his loyal moral support. They were playing a game of public perception, trying to destroy Eleanor's reputation before the trial began. But they did not know that Eleanor was not playing chess. She was preparing to burn the entire board, along with the players, with the evidence she had secretly kept. That night, Eleanor stood on the balcony of her children's room, looking at the city of New York with a much harsher gaze than before. She swore to the stars that Richard would never touch a single hair on her children's heads. This war was no longer about money or pride. It was a war for the survival and safety of her own blood. This war, she would use every cent, every contact, and all the power she had to make sure that Richard regretted the day he decided to use his children as bargaining chips. Eleanor took out her phone, called the best private detective in the country, and gave him a simple but terrifying instruction: dig their graves, find every sin, every bribe, every scandal they have ever committed. I want them destroyed before they set foot in the courtroom. The media storm engineered by Richard and Tiffany hit Eleanor's life with the force of a hurricane, turning a private divorce into a sensational and scandalous national spectacle. Television and online news portals were filled with exclusive interviews of Richard, perfectly playing the part of the aggrieved father, telling the sad story of how he was abandoned by a suddenly wealthy and arrogant wife with well-rehearsed crocodile tears. He described Eleanor as a cold and ambitious woman, more concerned with stock prices and board meetings than with changing diapers or nursing her babies. Public opinion, easily swayed by sentimental drama, began to turn against Eleanor. Hate hashtags emerged on social media, calling her a heartless mother and a woman who had forgotten her roots, creating immense psychological pressure for anyone without a steely mental fortitude. Behind the thick, soundproof walls of the Prescott Tower, Eleanor watched this media circus with a terrifying calm, as if she were watching a documentary about an endangered species. She did not allow herself to be provoked into making statements to the media, nor did she engage in a worthless war of comments, because she knew that half-truths would only muddy the situation. As shareholders began to grow restless about the company's slightly tarnished image, Eleanor ordered her public relations team to remain silent and not respond to any provocations. She was playing a long game, letting Richard feel victorious and become careless from his overconfidence. Meanwhile, in the dark operations room of her headquarters, a special investigation team was assembling the final pieces of the puzzle that would destroy her opponent in a single fatal strike. At his spacious desk, the head of the private detectives she had hired, a former military intelligence officer with a scarred face, placed a black external hard drive in front of Eleanor. The contents of that hard drive were a treasure trove of information far more damaging than a simple infidelity. It was Richard's criminal record, carefully hidden behind his company's double-entry bookkeeping. The investigation team had managed to infiltrate the servers of Richard's company and found hard evidence of tax evasion over the past 5 years, as well as illegal cash flows used to bribe local officials to obtain project licenses that did not meet standards. Not only that, they also found evidence of suspicious transactions to Tiffany's personal account, falsely labeled as consulting fees, when in reality it was company money Richard had stolen to finance his mistress's lavish lifestyle. But the ultimate weapon, the most lethal, was not Richard's financial crimes, but the video and audio recordings obtained from the luxury apartment where Richard and Tiffany lived. It turned out that the paranoid Tiffany had installed hidden cameras throughout the apartment to spy on her domestic staff, and that stupidity was now backfiring on her. The recordings showed vulgar conversations between Richard and Tiffany, planning in detail the extortion scenario for the children's custody. In the high-quality video, Richard's voice could be clearly heard laughing as he said that he did not care if his children were raised in an orphanage, as long as Eleanor paid the $100 million they were asking for. This evidence was no longer just war ammunition. It was a nuclear bomb that would annihilate their credibility as human beings before the law and society forever. Meanwhile, Richard and his cunning lawyer felt that victory was within their grasp. They interpreted Eleanor's silence as a sign of weakness and fear. They pushed for a private mediation meeting before the first hearing in the hope of intimidating Eleanor into quickly signing a settlement check. Eleanor agreed to the meeting, a tactical move designed to trap them even further in the hole they had dug for themselves. The meeting was held in the conference room of a neutral hotel, where Richard arrived in a new suit bought with a loan from a loan shark, his face beaming with a false victory. He sat across from Eleanor, looking at his ex-wife with disdain, convinced that the woman in front of him had surrendered to the public pressure he had created. The atmosphere in the mediation room was so tense that the air felt heavy. Richard's lawyer opened the conversation with an arrogant tone, placing a draft agreement on the table and demanding joint custody and an unreasonable amount of child support, or they would continue to destroy Eleanor's reputation until the Prescott Group's shares became trash. Richard added a threat, saying he would write a tell-all memoir revealing Eleanor's dark side if his demands were not met. He spoke as if he were a victim, generously offering Eleanor a way out, not realizing that every word of extortion that came out of his mouth was being recorded by a hidden microphone in Eleanor's diamond brooch. Eleanor sat there with a relaxed but alert posture. Her face showed no emotion as she listened to the two men's greedy ramblings. She did not argue. She did not get angry. She did not defend herself. She just asked intelligent questions to get them to repeat their threats in a more specific and incriminating way. "So, you would withdraw the custody claim if I transfer that amount? You don't really want the children?" Eleanor asked in a soft, deceptive voice. Richard, intoxicated by the vision of money, replied firmly, "Of course, Eleanor, we are realists. The children need their mother, and I need capital to start a new life. Give me the money, and you will never see me again." That sentence was the perfect confession, the last nail Eleanor needed to seal Richard's fate in court. Once she got the confession she needed, Eleanor stood up slowly, adjusted her jacket, and looked at Richard with a gaze that chilled his blood. She said neither yes nor no to his offer, just smiled slightly, the smile of a predator that has just finished playing with its food, and said, "We'll see in court, Richard. Enjoy your last days as a free man." She turned and walked out of the room with elegance, leaving Richard and his lawyer confused. The lawyer, with a sharper survival instinct, began to have a bad feeling, and warned Richard that something was not right with Eleanor's calmness, but Richard was too arrogant to listen, considering it a bluff from a desperate woman. In her private residence, Eleanor spent the night strengthening the defensive fortress around her children, ensuring that no negative impact from this war would touch them. She had hired the best cybersecurity team to block all negative content about her from the house's internet network, and ordered the nannies to keep the children's routine cheerful and normal. As she tucked her 3 children in, Eleanor looked at their innocent faces with an even more fiery determination. She was willing to be considered a villain by the whole world as long as her children were safe and knew that their mother loved them more than her own life. She kissed their foreheads one by one, silently promising herself that tomorrow in court she would clear her name and eliminate the threat of Richard forever. The night before the trial, Tiffany began to show signs of real panic. She called Richard repeatedly, hysterical because strange cars were watching her apartment and some of her high society friends were starting to avoid her as if she had a contagious disease. Tiffany urged Richard to make sure they would win tomorrow, because if they lost, she knew she would be dragged into total financial and social ruin. Richard tried to calm her with empty promises, although in his own heart, doubt was beginning to grow like a weed. He remembered Eleanor's last look in the mediation room, a look that did not reflect fear, but a terrifying certainty. But it was already too late to turn back. He had gambled everything on this poker table, and the wheel of fate was already spinning too fast to stop. The morning of the trial arrived with a cloudy sky over New York, as if the universe were holding its breath, waiting for the final battle. The courthouse was packed with a sea of journalists, eager for sensational news. Cameras flashed wildly when Richard and Tiffany's entourage arrived in celebrity style, waving as if they were heroes of justice. Shortly after, Eleanor's convoy of armored black cars arrived, making its way through the crowd with an authority that silenced the cheers. Eleanor got out of the car, flanked by her team of 12 elite lawyers, wearing an impeccable white suit that symbolized truth. Sunglasses covered her eyes, and her face was held high, challenging the world. She did not stop for interviews, her firm steps toward the courthouse door, ready to unleash the storm she had kept in the evidence folders carried by her assistant. Inside the crowded courtroom, the presiding judge banged the gavel to begin the session, and the atmosphere instantly became a silent but deadly battlefield. Richard's side was given the first opportunity to present their arguments, and his lawyer, with fervor, launched false accusations about Eleanor's inability to care for the children, supported by paid witnesses who gave false testimony under oath. Eleanor sat in silence, listening to all the slander without batting an eye, her hands calmly folded on the table, waiting for her turn like a chess grandmaster who lets her opponent advance their pawns before delivering the checkmate. When it was the defense's turn, Eleanor's lead lawyer stood up, smiled politely at the judge, and said in a loud voice, "Your Honor, we will not present a lengthy oral argument. We just want to show a video and present some financial audit documents that will explain everything." The large screen in the courtroom lit up, showing the recording from Tiffany's apartment in crystal-clear sound quality, revealing Richard and Tiffany's evil plan to the entire silent room. Richard's face went from red to ashen white as he heard his own voice saying he did not care about his children. Tiffany let out a choked cry and tried to cover her face as the journalists in the back seats gasped, realizing they had been supporting the real villain. The presiding judge looked at the screen with an expression of undisguised disgust, and then turned to look at Richard with a look that delivered a verdict even before the gavel struck. This was no longer just a custody hearing. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into a criminal trial for Richard and Tiffany, and Eleanor was there like an untouchable goddess of vengeance, witnessing the total collapse of her enemies. The silence that enveloped the courtroom after the video was played was far more tense than the bustle of any marketplace. The faces of those present, once filled with curiosity, now reflected a mixture of disgust and contained anger, directed squarely at Richard and Tiffany, who remained petrified in the defendant's box. The presiding judge looked at the now dark screen, his jaw tight, then turned his piercing gaze on Richard, who looked as if his soul had just been ripped from his body. Not a trace remained of the arrogance or the pitiful act he had previously displayed. All that was left was the trembling shell of a man realizing his mask had been shattered before the entire nation. Richard tried to open his mouth to deny, to say something that could salvage the situation, but nothing more than a pathetic, panicked hiss came from his dry throat. Eleanor's lead lawyer gave his opponents no breathing room to reassemble their already shattered defense. He approached the judge's bench with a stack of thick, impeccably bound documents, his face radiating the absolute confidence of an executioner ready to let the sword of justice fall. With a loud voice that resonated in every corner of the room, he declared that the video recording was just the tip of the iceberg of Richard's rotten character. He presented the evidence from the forensic audit that revealed the embezzlement of company funds, tax fraud, and money laundering that Richard had committed for years to finance his lavish lifestyle with his mistress. These documents were not mere papers, they were the final nails that would seal Richard's coffin forever, turning this civil case into an unavoidable criminal nightmare. The atmosphere in the room turned into a controlled chaos as journalists typed at a frantic speed, competing to be the first to spread the news of the young, corrupt businessman's dramatic downfall. Richard looked around with wild eyes, searching for support, but even his own lawyer was now distancing himself as if Richard were carrying a plague. The lawyer lowered his head, busy arranging his papers, clearly preparing a strategy to save his own reputation and abandon his already sunk client. Betrayal after betrayal began to occur on the opposing side, an ironic and satisfying sight for Eleanor, who quietly observed the collapse of that evil alliance from the other side of the table. She needed to do nothing more. The truth she had revealed had become an automatic weapon that fired relentlessly at her enemies. Next to Richard, Tiffany began to sob hysterically, but this time they were not fake tears to seek sympathy, but tears of pure terror as she saw her future destroyed before her eyes. She suddenly stood up and shouted that she knew nothing of the extortion plan, claiming that Richard had forced her and that she was just a victim of that evil man's manipulation. Tiffany tried to pull her hand away from Richard, who was trying to hold her, creating a shameful spectacle in which the two lovers blamed and attacked each other in front of the judge. Richard insulted Tiffany, calling her materialistic and greedy, while Tiffany responded by screaming that Richard was a bankrupt and useless con man. The scene was so pathetic and degrading that the judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly and forcefully to restore order in his sacred courtroom. Once order was difficultly restored, the presiding judge read his verdict with a tone that contained anger and unwavering legal authority. He declared that Richard had conclusively proven himself unfit to be a father and to have a bad faith that endangered the psychological and physical well-being of the children. The judge permanently revoked all of Richard's custody and visitation rights, granting full and exclusive custody to Eleanor without conditions. Not only that, the judge also issued a provisional arrest warrant for Richard and Tiffany for alleged extortion, fraud, and conspiracy, and ordered that the evidence of financial crimes be immediately handed over to the prosecutor's office to be processed as serious felonies. The verdict fell like a thunderbolt, reducing Richard's last hopes to ashes. Before he could process that his life had just ended, the side door of the courtroom opened and a squad of uniformed police officers entered with firm steps. They moved quickly toward the defendant's box, ignoring the weak protests of Richard, who was still trying to hide behind a social status that no longer existed. The cold, metallic sound of the handcuffs closing resounded loudly, marking his transition from a free businessman to a prisoner of the state. Richard resisted, his face red with shame and anger, his eyes staring at the journalists' cameras that were now mercilessly focused on him like a criminal. Tiffany did not escape a similar fate. She was escorted out, crying loudly, her makeup smudged and her expensive dress wrinkled, a tragic end to her empty socialite ambitions. As he passed Eleanor's table, Richard suddenly stopped struggling and looked at his ex-wife with a strange mixture of hatred, regret, and deep desperation. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps an apology or a final curse, but the words never came out because Eleanor did not look back at him. She simply sat upright, looking straight ahead, as if Richard were invisible air, refusing to give any kind of validation to the man who had tried to destroy her life. Eleanor's cold attitude was the harshest punishment for Richard's narcissism. He realized he no longer had any power to influence that woman's emotions, not even anger. He had become irrelevant, a distasteful footnote in Eleanor's glorious history. Eleanor stood up slowly after Richard and Tiffany were taken out of the room, adjusting her jacket with an elegant and dignified movement. She shook the hands of her legal team one by one, thanking them with a sincere, rarely seen smile for their hard work in clearing her name and protecting her. Children. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now felt relieved, as if the air had become lighter after the poison named Richard was removed. The journalists who were still in the room looked at Eleanor with a new respect. They no longer saw her as a scandal celebrity, but as a fighting mother and an invincible iron woman. Eleanor walked toward the main exit, her steps firm and rhythmic, ready to face a world that now awaited her with a completely different perspective. Outside the courthouse, the bright New York sun greeted Eleanor as if the universe were celebrating her victory with its best light. The crowd of journalists waiting on the steps immediately surrounded her, offering microphones and launching a barrage of questions about her feelings and future plans. However, Eleanor did not stop for a long interview. She only paused for a moment at the top of the stairs, slightly lowered her sunglasses, and said briefly that justice had been done and that her main focus now was to raise her children in peace. That simple sentence, spoken in a calm but firm tone, instantly became the main headline of all national news, affirming her position as a dignified and classy winner. Winston was already waiting by the open door of the limousine, his old face beaming with a pride he could not hide as he watched his young lady descend the courthouse steps like a queen. He bowed respectfully, deeper than usual, a sign of sincere homage to the strength of character Eleanor had shown during these difficult times. Eleanor smiled back at her loyal butler, feeling the heavy burden that had oppressed her chest for months finally lift completely. She entered the cool, comfortable car, closing the door to the bustle of the outside world and exhaling a long sigh that released the last of the tension from her muscles. In the silence of the car's cabin, she finally allowed herself to smile broadly, not a cynical smile of victory, but a pure smile of freedom. The car began to move, leaving behind the courthouse that had been a silent witness to the end of a dark chapter of her life, taking Eleanor back to her palace, where her 3 children were waiting for her. She took out her phone, looked at the wallpaper photo showing the cheerful faces of her children, and felt a warm wave of love flood her heart. Richard was just a painful past, an expensive lesson that had made her a stronger and wiser woman. Now the future stretched before her like a blank canvas, ready to be painted with the colors of happiness and success that she herself would create. She knew that business challenges would always exist, that new enemies might emerge, but she was no longer afraid because she was Eleanor Prescott, and she had just proven that she was indestructible. In the distance, the sirens of the police car taking Richard to pretrial detention could be faintly heard, a background sound that was fading into the hustle and bustle of the metropolis. For Eleanor, that sound was no longer a threat, but the final melody of a tragic opera she did not want to hear again. She ordered her driver to play relaxing classical music, drowning out the last vestiges of bad memories of that man. Her mind was now focused on the company's expansion strategy meeting next week, and on the plans for the first vacation with her children at their private estate in the Hamptons. Life went on, and Eleanor was determined to live it with her head held high, enjoying every second of her extraordinary life, which was now completely under her control.